Okay, we're ready to go. And now I can see you, Azril, as well. At least your name. So welcome to the first episode of this pod, the Café con Paulo Freire podcast. We've been focusing on learning, education and other things, but also on activism and how basically to get better at what we're doing, have a practical focus in all of this. As a university center and maybe as individuals as well, we're very good at talking and thinking and reflecting on things, but also how to translate that into something practical as well. So my name is Daniel Mossberg. I work with education and outreach here at CEMUS, the Center for Environment and Development Studies, here at Uppsala University. And also it's a fun episode because we have our office neighbors. I don't know if that is the formal term, but yeah, office neighbors from this U-shaped bend here at the Earth Sciences Department, the Geocentrum building, and also CEMUS affiliate, Ryan. But you all get to introduce yourself in this round that we get to. I should say something also about the episode. So it's based on the conference that was held mid-January over at Economicum here in Uppsala, the Political Ecologies of the Far Right. And I asked this AI function to translate that into something more catchy. So then it was like 10 different suggestions that I remixed. So there's a human involvement in this. But that translated into the roots of radicalism, which I think is an interesting starting point, a deep dive into the ecopolitics of the far right. And I wanted to maybe not to have the right, just the far, but that didn't translate into a good title. And we've been doing this podcast and this series since the autumn, but we started earlier also around the Paulo Freire 100-year anniversary. Yes, so we should do a round. All the sound is on, and I think we'll just go clockwise, and we can start with you. And basically just a name, position, 1 or 2 sentences about the research you're doing, and also why you wanted to attend the conference.
All right. So my name is Kosma Lechowicz. I'm a PhD student at Uppsala University at the program of Natural Resources and Sustainable Development. I'm pretty much halfway through my PhD. I'm doing a PhD in a project called Disassembling High Carbon Imaginaries. So what that entails is that I'm looking at visions of the future after coal phase out, specifically in Poland. So I'm doing some interviews with miners, activists, and other stakeholders in mining regions. So I don't do research on far-right per se, but I brush shoulders with far-right populism and so on, because a lot of miners that I speak to, they're exposed to this discourse of delay and different kind of strategies of framing green transition as something that is a threat to their livelihoods.
Yeah, and you had a presentation last week at the CEMUS Research Forum, CEFO, and then you also used AI in a very creative way. You put in a quote and asked the AI to make an image out of it, which I found very interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That was a very interesting thing. I got the result. I put a quote by one of the miners, and I asked the AI to generate an image that would represent a speaker, someone who said that. And they generated a couple of images, and one of them was a very sexy naked miner in the mine, and that's because the quote referred to connection between coal and body.
Yeah, so and images is not so good in a podcast, but maybe we can add that somewhere, or maybe later when you're finished with your PhD. Okay, Emmy, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Kosma. I'm very sad to have missed your presentation on that. It sounds very exciting. But yes, so I'm Emmy Iwarsson, and I am quite a new PhD student here at the department, also in the division of Natural Resources and Sustainable Development. And my topic relates very much to local food systems and localism in relation to food, and looking into opportunities for leveraging a transition towards more local food systems in the Swedish context. And I think localism is the key term here, because I think that very much relates to some of the ideas that we will discuss here today, and also some of the ideas that were very much discussed during the conference. Transitioning to the local and local nature and what that means in different contexts and in different discourses. So I think that was my main entry point into the conference.
Cool. And my name's Ryan Carolan. I'm a former PhD student, so long as my submission goes all right. And my PhD's on focuses on the Murray-Darling Basin, which is the biggest river system in Australia, the commodification of water, basically the implications of neoliberalism in relation to this river, and how it transformed also the state and is sort of reproducing this very destructive policy, which is not helping in any way to address the ecological crisis on the river system. So yeah, that's that. And why I'm interested. The main reason I went, apart from the fact that I knew that people from CEMUS were going, is because it was in Uppsala. I'm interested in the topics, but I mean, I wouldn't really travel to a conference. It's not really my thing, but it's in Uppsala, so it felt like a nice local thing to do. And it was great. I'm glad I did. Unfortunately, I was only there for one day though, so I'll be more listening, I suspect, than talking so much today. But I'm very glad to be a part of it and to hear people's reflections on what they experienced.
Yeah, and it was a very intensive conference, at least for me. So so one day is enough to talk about for hours, at least for me. Okay, now we're going to transition over to you as well. Azril, you get to introduce yourself and just hang on like 2 seconds before I switch over to you.
Great to meet with nice bunch of people that share similar concerns. My background is as an agricultural engineer. My PhD in sociology dealt with far right, with focus on Trumpism. In that sense, I'm concerned with the cultural war being waged by the far right, and also hinting in climate denialism. And I'm doing now a second PhD in Córdoba in Spain. It's similar to what Kosma is doing. It's now formulated as natural resources and sustainable management, but when I did the classwork, it was agroecology and sustainable development. So now liberalism has hit even the language. So the project for the doctoral degree in Córdoba has to do with the project I was co-responsible in Mexico into peasant communities. And I'm looking at extensionism, agricultural extension. That is a topic that has come up at CEFO a couple of times. And I'm looking at traditional extensionism from the Freirean perspective, which is the communication of persuasion. You convince farmers, peasants what is best for them, or you engage in dialogue, and then it's co-researching, co-learning. So that's, and about the conference, I think was greatly organized, very rich, inspired me a lot. And then it was followed by Kosma's fantastic presentation of his PhD work. So, and we are nearing now the third year of this program, Coffees with Paulo Freire. Daniel has said what it is about. And we try to bridge this, let's say, the contemporary scene, what's happening, like in the world, what is the world going to be like if Trump gets reelected, that he threatens us to do in terms of climate and so on. So I think that's, enough.
Okay, thank you, Azril. So we should get into this. A very primitive idea for this would be to do a round, but we also want to jump into different things. So I think we just need somebody to start us off. in all of this. Maybe if I start with a short reflection on some of the things I picked up, and then we can just do a round, but we can also jump in and comment and discuss the different things. And Azril, if you still can hear us, I think you can mute, but also then just raise your hand or wave, and then I can just get you into the conversation as well. Okay. There's so many different things, many different ideas and topics and discussions. I didn't talk to that many people because I felt a certain overload of ideas and other things. But it was a good format that you could be part of parts of the conference, but you can also listen in online. So I did listen, then walked my dog and did other things. So I think was also good for my own sanity. But I think a couple of key points that was important for me. It was a very interesting parallel session on Indian Hindu nationalism and how Modi, the Prime Minister of India, how he and his party and the nationalism that they had kind of created over the last 10 years, or maybe before then, but when he came into power, and how the Hindu nationalism and being active and an international player on climate was not in opposites. So climate denialism wasn't a core thing that they had integrated into the party, rather the opposite. So adopting a kind of a radical leftist language, whether it's around climate justice or other things, but also very actively trying to build energy infrastructure, like wind power. So one of the presentations was specifically on wind power. One was on solar power. And the one that stuck with me was on the wind power plants they were building. So it was part of trying to reshape a Muslim majority part of India. So what they did was basically come in and bribe or pay off or make agreements, depending on what language you want to use, with community leaders. So then they bought a piece of land that was part of their traditional land, but also part of the village and the community, and basically put up what we would say like contemporary modern wind power plants, with the add-on that at the bottom of the wind power plants, they would also build Hindu temples. So the nationalism and the climate action and all of that was kind of manifested in this merge of different things. So that was very interesting. And that presentation sparked ideas around how do we research and study and look at climate denialism in a Swedish research context. And I didn't go to the parallel session that focused on Sweden, but yeah, I'm from here, so I have some insight at least into that. And how I reflected on that maybe the thing that is the core aspect of nationalism or far-right parties or activism in Sweden is not so much around climate denialism, but rather that you don't want, whether it's the big cities or specifically Stockholm and these big international companies, or whether it's Chinese companies, to come in and build this energy infrastructure that becomes something that is from the outside. So reacting in climate science is maybe not your core thing that motivates you. It's rather resources being extracted from your local world where you live, but also these kind of huge infrastructure projects manifesting what is wrong in an unjust society, but also what is wrong in the relationship between cities and rural parts in Sweden. Because you could imagine a wind power plant in a Swedish context having that kind of strange add-on, not a Hindu temple, but something that was as kind of opposite to the local. But also issues around local democracy in Sweden, and how if it was a local democratic issue of deciding over where resources go, what happens to electricity and how it's exported, or what is actually built, then the issue might be a bit different. So that was one of my reflections. Azril, you have your hand up as well. Do you want to jump in on that or another reflection? You just have to hang on 2 seconds before we have to turn up your sounds. So hang on.
Yeah, I want to jump on what you just said. And the reflection and provocation is, this is exactly where we are dealing with populism. So in the conference, out of the conference, we're aware that populism creates very astute ways to channel interest, like with the climate, like Modi does it in his own way. Now he's having an Indian temple on top of a Muslim mosque. So it's in Sweden, we also have similar populistic moves about climate, like when Swedish Democrats supported and voted to lower tax on benzene, on what makes the fossil energy run in Sweden, they got more votes. So in a way, they are like octopus creating channels for different segments of the population in a marketing way that we lag behind. That was one of the comments I brought at the conference, that we seem to run quite behind what populism logic is accelerated and winning votes in Sweden, in the States, and India, and all over the place. So in a way, it's how to relay the knowledge, the information we produce in these privileged spaces that we call universities. How do we relate this knowledge produced with the input from society, because it's subsidized by society, but then how is this related to strategies to counteract, minimum, to go maybe beyond, to redefine the agenda, and then a strategy and action to make a breach in that way. So it's, I think it's a complement to your reflection, but then we go on to our guests.
Thank you, Azril. Should we continue in this direction for this round as well? Something you picked up at the conference and reflections afterwards, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks for getting us started with this. I didn't go to this session you mentioned, but I read a lot about situation in India with solar parks and wind parks and this land acquisition, the problematic land acquisition and bribing and so on. So that is definitely a big issue, and I would agree with what you said, that a lot of locals, all the movements on the ground, they react, they oppose not so much global capitalism mostly, or just foreign companies coming in. So that's something that was a reoccurring theme, I think, for me during different sessions. Mm-hmm. A lot of people observed that it's not so much capitalism in general, but it's the global capitalism. So the kind of the message seemed to be that as long as it's kind of our entrepreneurs, our companies making car batteries or something, then we're fine with it. But it's just the big American companies, the foreign capital. That's what these most of the far right movements that were mentioned they were opposing to. And I would somehow like to also refer to what Azril said about our role as researchers and generating knowledge and relaying this knowledge to society, because I was kind of maybe not trolling the sessions, but in most of the sessions I attended, I was asking the question of what is the purpose of us labeling these movements as far right and coming up with these categories, because for me I guess that kind of touches on what's our aim in doing this research. Are we trying to build solidarity, build alliances, or are we trying to kind of make, I don't know, strict categories so that we know which movements not to engage with? Because I guess that's the danger for me of very strong labels. If we label a movement as far right, then perhaps we shouldn't engage with them. So it's kind of like, where's the line? That was kind of the reoccurring theme for me. Like, what what happens, what's the implication of doing this kind of diagnosis. But then also there was a lot of talk about the implications of doing what I call good vibes only research. So when you just focus on the positive and like, okay, let's focus on what we have in common and unite different movements, then perhaps you could invite movements with problematic political agendas. But then if you go the other extreme and you diagnose them as far right, then there is no room for dialogue. So it's, I don't have an answer, but that was the recurring question I had.
Yeah, and a very short comment on that is that I also realized, maybe this is a very basic thing, but making a study of party manifestos online or if they're in print, compared to doing like a long series of interviews, or like we talked about, Ryan, if you do an anthropological field work over 2-4 years, whatever is feasible, you find very different things. Maybe they're complementary, that they can kind of help and broaden the picture. But if you're only looking at what is written in party manifestos, for example, or if you follow up with like what is said in media by party representatives, you get a very limited kind of vision. That kind of is the same thing you're saying as well, that it becomes something that is very other and not maybe something, because I think the key aspect, and I think also what the conference aimed at and maybe the research aimed at is, I mean, you want to understand something so you can also maybe change it. Maybe the change part is not so explicit, but at least that's for me. If I understand something better, you can find openings or ways to change yourself or maybe change others as well. Do you want to continue the round?
I'll do that. I'll follow on from what Kosma just said, I think, because some of the same issues actually sort of stayed with me after the conference, but also I think in general this categorization that can be very difficult, and it was also very obvious during the conference that people were struggling with this. There were a lot of questions asked, definitional questions, people wanting answers, like what does this mean? How do we think about these things? How do we use these things? So I also felt like that was sort of part of the atmosphere almost of like the whole conference, people trying to conceptually capture things in a good way. But I also think, speaking of climate change, I also found it really interesting, sort of the contrast between the far-right sort of outright denialism of climate change and also this sort of eco-modernist approach to it, that the solutions given once climate change is incorporated into sort of like a political agenda on the far-right, it's often very eco-modernist, but other times it's very sort of like localist, very like purist in a way. And I attended many of the overlap sessions that were called overlaps between left and right sort of political agendas. And then there were a lot of discussions about like when we have two movements who are sort of but just opposing the global neoliberal capitalism, but for two different reasons. One for very anti-democratic, sort of like from a very anti-democratic sort of rationale. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with this endpoint being not the same, but similar for different reasons? And like, that was sort of something that I think I come across that in my own work also quite a lot. So I think that was also something that stayed with me and that I really, that I'm still struggling a little bit with, sort of like how to think about these. It's also, I guess, dangerous to say that there are overlaps because they're not really. But I mean, when the outcome is sort of the opposition of the current system, it becomes tricky to deal with. And and I think also what you just said, Kosma, about this this sort of I don't even know what to call it, but maybe like this risk of your own arguments being co-opted for other reasons than you meant them to be used for. I think that was also something I was thinking about in terms of what was the aim of the conference. Because I think to navigate these issues, you also need to know how things are thought about in different ways. And especially when it comes to the far right, as we see movements across Europe and other parts of the world really gaining ground. So I think those were my main takeaways.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, the session on Latin America, and specifically Uruguay, one of the biggest far-right nationalist populist party. They had integrated a kind of anti-globalist stance, but especially also to forest companies coming in and with these paper mills, especially from Finland as well. So, but that was also because the left had kind of abandoned that issue of being like, well, protecting nature, but also protecting people's and workers' rights. I'm making an extension of the argument that was made there, or the presentation. But so then that space opened up for the far right, and they were part of the government coalition now, I think, or maybe historically a couple of years back. But anyways, the environmental and forest protection was like a deal breaker for them. So if that hadn't been instituted, they wouldn't have been part of the government, and they wouldn't have been that government. So that was very interesting, because then also for me, I realized that if nature protection and the far right is not in opposites, that opens up a whole different space. But also the failure of centrist or leftist or traditional right politics opens up a space for all sorts of parties from all sorts of mixes, or left, right, or whatever scale we can use. And maybe the scale is just broken as it is now as well. Yeah. Ryan?
Yeah. It's a lot to think about, isn't it? I guess one thing that I was struck by was the amount of political science. Like, I didn't expect so many political scientists there. I guess it makes sense on reflection, but it's interesting how they they use this word ecology, which I've come with my own baggage, and they use it in a very different way to the way that I would usually think about it. Because for me, ecology is a very relational concept, and as we're kind of saying a little bit, it seems like they're trying to categorize the far right and study it almost independently as an essence unto itself. So I think this is sort of leads to what you were talking about with the sort of focus on linguistics and sort of abstracting it very much from its context. But it also strikes me as kind of interesting. Yeah, I'm in my thesis, I draw a lot on Karl Polanyi. I'm sure you're familiar with Karl Polanyi. And Karl Polanyi always saw social movements in reaction to a greater force. And so in his case, it's laissez-faire capitalism, free market capitalism. And to me, neoliberalism is essentially the same thing. And it's striking, I think, that they can isolate the far right and study how, develop the different language or study the different language which is used to describe them in an effective way, but they don't see them as a reaction to this very, very potent force of neoliberal globalization, which has basically colonized most of the world, destroyed the capacity of welfare states and public institutions across the world to control and, to use Polanyi's language, embed the market in social relations, and subjected vast amounts of the world to the rule of capital and the market. So if people in our position don't also understand that context, I think it's very dangerous, because it's very easy to see them as a binary thing, as a good evil kind of representation, which we should be trying to get away from. And then to just say something about your comments on the combination of Hindi nationalism and environmentalism, it also makes, I think what you're talking about is reciprocity a little bit as well, like having some justification for being able to build something in the environment where they don't live. And that's one of the things that is, a decontextualized economic analysis doesn't take into consideration the very anthropological fact of reciprocity being a foundational aspect of social relations. But it does make me think about what offsets are in that context, because aren't offsets a perfect representation of the temple in our world, where we can just build something and we say, well, we can counteract that by building something or protecting something somewhere else. And I think it really represents the fact that our religion is mathematics. Our religion is some sort of equilibrium, which is very much thinking of economics. So I think that's also would be something very interesting to think about in terms of thinking about it in terms of religion or Yeah, probably religion or spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's then the temple for a capitalist becomes the kind of the wind power mills or the solar cells or the solar plant becomes like a symbol of success and progress. For an environmentalist, it becomes this is the new kind of shiny energy infrastructure that can kind of solve all our problems, or at least a lot of them. But then it depends, I mean, or for me at least, it is what kind of other politics does there exist that is not the eco-modernistic build a new infrastructure or the neoliberal capitalist model. And I don't know if localism it doesn't necessarily have to be anti-capitalistic or anti-new energy infrastructure, but yeah. I don't know if you have a comment on that, and then I'll let you in, Azril.
Yeah, I can just comment shortly, because I know that Kosma went to the same session as me on degrowth, where they actually had a lot of speakers talking about how these, some of these movements actually are against just free market capitalism in the very degrowth sense of like degrowing to social relationship exchange and really like rebuilding social bonds to each other in like a very local setting, and keeping exchange to this very small sort of like bounded area. So in that sense, it turns out that some of the groups that were discussed actually are both local and against local capitalism in its very essence.
Yeah, that was kind of something that opened my eye a bit too, because I was a bit naive before. I thought, okay, anything local is of course good, but and again, this kind of categories good bad come into play, like how I categorize them myself. And then there are these degrowth local movement that are deeply racist and exclusionary. And they also kind of what's interesting that spirituality also is at play there, because they reject Christianity as the first colonization of Europe. So they want to return to paganism. So that was super interesting for me.
Okay.
It's kind of local racist paganism.
Let's get back to that thread. But Azril, just hang on a second and I'll let you in.
By now there are different subjects to address. If we take spirituality, we see a politicization of religion. The Pope is now ecologically and climate friendly. He writes this encyclical, but on the extreme right of the Catholic Church, like Opus Dei and Vox, in a more militant way, they attack the Pope. So it's not a common front, so to speak. So for Modi and his kind of Indian nationalism, fundamentalism, not to forget that he was a Hindu fundamentalist that killed Gandhi. So Modi himself, he's managed to skip so far, but this empirical growing documentation that he was behind the wave of anti-Muslim racist riots, murdering, burning, and so on and so forth. He controls the press. This is anti-Modi press. So this thing about point counterpoint, where we try to categorize and do our conventional research, I see the populist pundits, because they have intellectuals like Steve Bannon doing the interpreting and giving the lines for action, the strategies, successfully so, in the States, in Europe, and so on. So I would say the contemporary paradox is that everything is being politicized and polarized. So religion and spirituality is one. But let's take terms like democracy. Today, our Nazis don't call themselves National Socialists. They call themselves Sverigedemokrater, Swedish Democrats. The more Nazi call themselves National Democrats, because democracy today has linguistic value. In Spain, they created and then collapsed, was too much a balloon in the air, Ciudadanos, that use the same democratic rhetoric. We are the real citizens, okay? So we're dealing with a phenomena, and I don't think political scientists are good, especially good at that. We're dealing with the realm of propaganda and counter-propaganda, of cultural warfare, and we are not there. We are not there, and we can see that we are not even responding to the multiplicity of fronts opened by a more solid, maybe better finance, has think tanks, yes, which is an important topic. They have think tanks, they're then thinking, and then helping their non-thinking and just following what Trump says, like a sect. So we're dealing with something that is not so rational, it's not so easy to categorize in academic definitions or concepts or terms. So I will finish this kind of reflections on the spot by saying we need think tanks to be able to grasp not just the structural, historical, 500 years or 6,000 years, like Fabian Scheitler writes in The End of the Mega Machine. But we need to also to be doing day by day analyzing, like Timbro does in Stockholm, like all these multiple think tanks are doing. And then something that links to what Ryan brought. Okay, so we academics, we want to be engaged, we want to be relevant and meaningful. And then how do we balance these roles as researchers and as citizens? And my perception, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that playing the academic game is almost like a self-fulfilled prophecy. It's like, looking at your belly button. There's not much time left for other kinds of civic engagement, meaning citizenship, engaged citizenship, in this case, for the climate. It's more like an invitation to move beyond this trap. I see it as a trap, as a time trap.
Thank you, Azril. A lot of different things there, but populism, or I'm thinking also, and this is one of the reflections from the conference, is like how would because if you accept the kind of premise that the left or the middle or whatever we're talking about, or like country institutions like the university or other parts, that they have kind of abandoned certain spaces where the populists have moved in, whether it's tech and surveillance in society, or there's a long list of at least CEMUS issues that have been part of CEMUS courses that I don't know if it's been abandoned in the courses. Some of them, it might be harder. But what I'm thinking is basically, what would a populist version of science or doing research look like? Or in CEMUS case with education, I mean, it is populist in the sense that it's student-initiated courses, so it has that populist lean. But I'm thinking also with our, like you said, Azril, our responsibilities as researchers, but also as citizens in all of this. Because if everything was kind of, if this was a very slow-moving, like, set of disasters evolving over 10,000 years, we would have a lot of time. And maybe rushing into things is not the best things, but anyone help me out with this thread on threads, and also what Azril said.
Yeah, I mean it's a it's a big topic. It's something I'm thinking about since I started this PhD, the role of researcher and this question of navel gazing and just producing kind of science for the sake of science and having lots of stimulating debates. Because that's something that I'm constantly reminded of, even by my supervisors when I write. Just kind of remember about your role. You're a researcher. You're not an activist. You're writing for a scientific journal. Activists are not going to read it probably. Citizens are not going to read it. It's just other researchers. So I'm kind of writing for the community of researchers. So I have to constantly, and it's a valuable reminder, and also I guess a lesson in humility, because you kind of have to be aware of what you can achieve within the constraints of academia, while at the same time I think it is worth to like try to expand it and maybe bring something into academia that's not traditionally had place in academia. Like there's more talk about militant anthropology and activist research and things like that. So I think these are valuable insights, but I think what I'm thinking about is also this relationality that Ryan mentioned, that ecology is first and foremost about relationality, and I would agree with that. So in my research, I'm trying to foreground these interrelations, whatever different groups, social groups have in common, and how it can be mobilized productively, generatively to build a movement, to do something new, to kind of build dialogue across differences. And I think that's difficult if we focus on categorizing, and if we focus on creating these, or maybe not creating divisions, but kind of reinforcing them. I think there's a lot of talk in academia when you study ecological issues and sustainable development issues about what concepts to choose, whether you're going to go for historical materialist approach, and that way you're clearly political, you're on the correct side of things and so on. But then if you go for some more post-humanist, post-modern concepts, then you're being accused of being apolitical, focusing too much on non-humans and nature, and then you risk disadvantaging humans. So it's kind of like, I guess that's something that I'm struggling with, because I would like to think that there is a way of doing both, of combining both, or finding the niche in between, or maybe not even kind of entering this debate, maybe just doing something alongside this debate, outside this debate, and then focusing on this relationality with the purpose of building something together, rather than finally deciding which approach is best.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add. I think Kosma captured it very well, but I think this is for me also a constant identity crisis, and will remain that way, I think. But I also come from having worked a lot with scholar activists in different ways, and I think that's a very productive way of sort of like reconciling activism and academia. But it will also be, I think for me, working in interdisciplinary settings is also a challenge in this way, because sort of blending and mixing together natural science and social science is sometimes a struggle, in the sense that it's an ontological fundamental difference sometimes, and it's hard to navigate that as someone who wants to do both in a way. But I think also that we of course need critical research in all areas of society for different sort of, of course we need that. But I also think there was something else you said, Kosma, that stuck with me. I think but I just feel like to have a productive political sphere, whatever that is, I think research is fundamental in that way also, because of time. Because I feel like in academia we might not feel that there's time, but there's at least time to look into things in a different way, that I feel like a lot of NGOs and a lot of people that are actually trying to achieve some sort of change are always struggling in terms of having funding and having enough resources to actually be able to do that. So I feel like there are also synergies that could be harnessed and explored in many ways, I think.
I think the one thing that, or maybe the two things that help me to like not worry about the distinction between those two as like a strict distinction, being a scientist, which I don't even categorize myself as a scientist. I study philosophy. I'm a philosopher. So is the idea of objectivity being something abstract, as though I'm looking at something that I'm completely independent from. I think that's a particular conception of objectivity, which isn't the only conception. To me, objectivity is about integrating multiple perspectives, taking them all into account, and trying to give a full, whole picture of a situation. And also to try and open up more possibilities for action. So it's about being critical. Objectivity is about being critical. And then the other thing is about I'm not just a philosopher, I'm a particular kind of philosopher, process philosopher. So I see myself as in a tradition and continuing a tradition of thought. And I believe that universities benefit from traditions arguing with each other. So I think that people benefit from being aware of the different traditions that they're part of. And often they come into conflict. Often you've got to work out ways to synthesize them. Often there's weaknesses in both. So if we have an argument, Kosma, you cause me also to reflect on my tradition and see its own weaknesses and develop it. So I become part of the tradition and further the tradition. So that's very much how I see the potential for academia. And for me, my tradition is questioning the mechanistic worldview and trying to raise an alternative. So ecology is very powerful in that sense, because studying relationships, that relationships are full of unpredictability, emergence, they're non-linear, they're all these sort of different things that are going on. So it's at the core of how I think about it, is addressing sort of these issues. And then the other thought is just about democracy. There's a great there's a great title of a paper by Wendy Brown. It's called "We're All Democrats Now," and she says, no matter who you ask across the world, any kind of populist, reactionary, liberal, conservative, everyone classifies themselves as a Democrat. Democracy's colonized the world, and yet the term she says it's an empty signifier. It's something that everyone can attach their hopes and dreams to, but it really amounts to nothing. And this is what Orwell taught us. The ability to transform words into their opposites. Democracy is such a powerful conception if we understand its historical roots and what it means about having control, as a community, having control over your life, having some control over your life. But it's also a struggle to be able to have the understanding, develop the relationships, have the culture, etc., to maintain it. And democracy just now has been seamlessly integrated with neoliberal economics. So you have an election every 4 years and they say, well, you elected us, so now we can do what we want for 4 years. And like Trump said on his, what is his truth social media page, that the president must have the right to do whatever he wants to do in that 4-year period without any possibility of courts overriding him. Otherwise, how could he possibly act at all? It's going back to kings, because we have this idea of democracy seamlessly connected also with massive concentrations of power. It's bizarre. That's the opposite of democracy. So we need to reclaim these concepts and the historical meaning of them, but also be brave enough to redefine them or rethink them if that's necessary, if they've become ossified.
Thank you. Just a short note on ecology and democracy. Ecology could be read like Hitler. We need Ukraine to produce food, then we will do war with the Soviet Union, because we, as the higher race, have the natural right, according to natural law, to occupy this for our existential survival of the fittest. This is like right Nazi reading of ecology. So we read ecology with also colored lenses, not with objective, neutral categories. So the democracy then comes with a value. Demos, puts equality in the picture. For Hitler and social Darwinists like him, then the basic law is inequality, racial inequality, and so on. And democracy brings the idea of fair distribution of resources, of more equal. So what is interesting when I saw at SLE how they were dealing with agroecology, there was a view of ecology as a kind of automatism, self-regulating, homeostasis. So whatever you do, the earth will be resilient enough to manage this new challenge to natural survival, so to speak. Maybe not atomic warfare, which we have to face. But I thought one way to challenge this kind of ecological automatism, kind of holy homeostasis approach, is precisely through a participatory democracy, which is not the same as populist democracy. It's not, they got more votes, that's what the people want, that's democracy. No, you can, again, think through over electoral democracy as the only way to measure and to advance democracy and so on. So in a way, is how we read these concepts or disciplines that then it will frame certain questions and certain methodologies and then gain certain results. So when Ryan said, okay, I'm in philosophy. Well, we are all in philosophy. I mean, if we could do the task of questioning our concepts, our terms, and see alternative ways to redefine them, to frame them, and just to shut my big mouth. People like Freire, not only, but who will say, yes, we need information. We need to read the context to understand. But what for? To keep it the way it is? To enlarge our curriculum? To project our careerism? To maybe feed information for the powerful that already have lots of information about social control? And Freire said, no, we wish in our approach to science, academy, research, education, higher education, upper education, to transform a reality that is not natural, is a constructed social, historical, political result of a process that needs to be changed because it favors, let's say, the 1% and misfavors the 99%. I'm exaggerating for the sake of the argument, but you get my point.
Yeah, we should, and this is a perfect everything you said, but also you, Azril, because we've made a commitment in this podcast to be practical, not when we're in the podcast, but rather divert our thinking towards that as well. For me, in the CEMUS context, I think the courses that we do, and maybe also some of the events, it's very much in the university, and it's in our heads, maybe in part certain times in our feelings, but it's not the percentage of course or the time spent by students in courses that is spent not in a traditional classroom or studying on your own or with co-students, it's very low, I would say. That goes for a lot of university education. Some of them have more practical components, but I think that's a very concrete thing. And how it connects to all of this, I think it's just basically if you spend time in other people's realities and everyday life, you're gonna pick up different things, and you're gonna also be much more humble about your analysis of what is wrong, but also the solutions to what is wrong. Let's start with you, Ryan, now and go the round backwards. If you would pick up something practical in general from this conversation or from the conference or these things we've been thinking about, is there a to-do list?
Well, the first thought, we can argue about democracy for a long time, but the key thing is that if it's written down on a piece of paper, it can mean 100, almost, maybe more, different things. So doing linguistic analysis maybe isn't enough to understand what a party is all about or what a particular movement is all about. So maybe it's got something to do with, trying to find ways to bring back some kind of, I guess I could call it a phenomenological perspective. Oh, I got that out. Or a hermeneutic perspective or a dialectical perspective. Something, a gestalt even, a sort of foreground, background, something where there's seen as a relationship between foreground and background a little bit more, and something that can give a little bit more justification to, as you said, anthropology study, like embodied study in a physical environment in order to understand its dynamics and have a more nuanced and holistic picture of why certain things happen. And then, obviously, perhaps develop better responses to those things that can be not so conducive to extremist activities. So finding ways to defend and support those kind of educational methods is one initial thought that I had. How to do it? I need to get a job first.
Yeah, that's very practical. And if I put you on the spot from your finished PhD and what you just said, if you would translate that into a catchy course title, kind of the thing I did with the AI function.
Yeah, okay.
No sexy minors, but
embodying the self in a complex world of... No, I don't know. No. Give me a minute to think about it.
Okay, we can come back to that. Now the rest of you are already churning on that question. Okay, Emmy, something
practical. I think also just continuing to be very humble and interrogating ourselves and the concepts we use and why we use them and how we use them, and finding also just being just self-aware and, as you said, kind of try to justify why we're doing what we're doing and defending that at the same time as being, because I think there's a danger in locking oneself in and putting oneself in stark contrast to something else without being willing to sort of like have a dialogue, not necessarily like person to person, but like to confront oneself with other arguments and building one's own argumentation stronger in relation to that. So I think not resisting completely discourse-wise, but to engage and try to counter and just keep discussing. I think it's great to have these discussions because I think for me the conference sparked a lot of interesting discussions afterwards, and things still keep popping up. And it was also interesting that it brought together, as all conferences do, I guess, but I felt this one in particular, people who attended for so many different reasons and from so many different disciplines that some questions were asked and you couldn't see where they were coming from. But then there was a very interesting answer given to it. So I think that was, so just keep, and this podcast is a great example of
and also during the conference I reflect on that the younger researchers, I don't know if young is below 40 or 30 or whatever, but people who had done a PhD or were in their PhDs, those were the presentations and the discussions that were most impressive. And I don't want to comment if they were not impressive, the other ones, but the things that stuck with me was from young researchers, basically. Maybe we should also say that writing, doing research, all of that is, or education for that matter, is also a very practical thing. I mean, it is actually engaging with something, you creating something. So, but yeah, maybe practical beyond the traditional things that we do. Do you have a catchy course title if you would translate your research or reflections in general from the conference or anything?
I might need to get back to you on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think what you just said, that there were like these young researchers, they presented the most interesting research. I think that's partly due to what Ryan mentioned or advocated for, this more embodied kind of research, so putting yourself out there. I think these younger researchers, they leave the ivory tower, so it's not just kind of policy document analysis and writing up articles and then coming up with more policy recommendations, but actually engaging with movements, putting yourself out there. And I think that's what I like. That's my jam. I have anthropology as my background, so I like to view myself as a sort of a sensor. Of course, not just an objective sensor. I don't insert myself in the situation and absorb what's happening, but I do it through my training, things I read, and so on. So I think that's one way of doing it. But podcasts and kind of bringing the results back into the public and society in general, I think that's something we have to think about a bit more, but also bringing the results back to participants of the research. That's something I'm thinking about, because it's not really something I'm required to do. It's not part of the project. It's not something I would get money for from university, but that's something I would like to do, to somehow bring all these respondents together, all the people that gave me this knowledge, and put them together in a room or on an exhibition or something, so that they can get to know the results. So maybe that will be this populist science making. Yeah.
And course title, that's hard maybe.
Course title?
A populist course title. Yeah, or your research or reflections from the conference, or just anything.
Make populist science great again.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
I got one as well.
Yeah.
Re-embodying through decommodification. Responding to neoliberalism through creative play.
That's a fancy title. It's a bit elitist, maybe.
I mean,
but
I did think about it. I mean, I am elitist too. So.
Yeah. Maybe you also can ask the AI function to make something very academic into something very populist and appealing to the masses. Maybe that's an interesting home assignment.
I haven't even used AI. I can do all these great things. I'm too scared of it.
It's scary.
Yeah, it's scary, and depends on what you're asking for. What kind of images?
Minus.
Yeah,
can come up.
Yeah, I'm putting quotes in there. Yeah, there's a ton of other things as well. We're gonna let you in at the end here, Azril, as well. For if you have a brief comment, I'll do that now. Just hang on.
Name of a course, Transformative Research and Higher Education. And a short comment, in your presentation, Kosma, the distinction between the person and the racist, to be able to make this distinction both in research, in how we approach, how we relate, and then it has a potential of change through enabling dialogue, and then through dialogue, the possibility of change.
Thank you, Azril. Our time is up, and we should also extend a thank you to the organizers of the conference. There's not a lot of these conferences here in Uppsala or nearby, unfortunately. Over the years, I think before the pandemic, there was quite a few that had this mix, and also different people and different researchers coming together. But there's haven't been that many, at least not here in Uppsala or nearby. So that's great. So many different thoughts and things to build on. And maybe I should end on that as well, that the CEMUS always has an open door to any strange or or simple ideas of things you want to do. And also as you've seen today with all the tech, where you have also great opportunities for recording, whether it's like things like this or video and other things. But there's also resources over at Blåsenhus in the recording studios. And also usually if you do a YouTube video and your name is not one of those that is highlighted by the algorithms, you get like 20 views. But at least then you have 20 people engaged in that thing. But you could also engage other people like Kevin Anderson, who's here and visiting researcher, because if you put up a video with his name and he's in it, you get like 7,000-8,000 views. So we can think of smarter ways also in engaging in communication, because that's also one thing the populists and the far right has been very, very successful in communicating and actually reaching certain issues that engage people out there as well. So, but again, thanks everybody, and that's a wrap. Thanks for today.